financial community this year, we postulated 3 questions to structure the discussions with about 50 leaders, and in addition we talked to leaders of international institutions and so on. And the first was, is there enough capital? Well, for all that I just said about balance sheets, actually we get a very strong message that there is plenty of capital, and I use one quote from the report. We have vast amounts of money, said one member of the financial community. The question is, what is the risk-adjusted cost of capital? The second question is whether we have the right financial framework and the right structure. Sure, in most developed countries we have very sophisticated financial systems, but in the energy sector we have a combination of a change in the supply and demand dynamics of energy, a very rapid evolution of the technologies, and more emphasis being given to the 3 goals rather than, as maybe some years ago, there would just have been an emphasis on security of energy supply. And all of that is impacting on the nature of the investment challenge and on the ability of investors to do what is needed. And it's this nexus of policy with those developments in the energy sector itself, on technologies, energy supply and demand, that creates this new environment that is proving extremely challenging. And if you think about developing countries, well, they have a whole set of other challenges, in particular driving access to energy and producing the sophistication of financial system and the adequacy of human and other capital to drive these investments at the pace that are needed. Then the final question, which I think is a really interesting one, is can the energy sector absorb investment if that investment were to be forthcoming, if the policymakers get the policy frameworks right, if the financial infrastructure evolves in the way that it needs to, as quickly as it needs to, could the energy sector respond? And we're getting a fairly strong message that actually this could be a big issue because there is a lack of bankable projects in the pipeline. That's derived from very many factors, but one of them certainly is this understanding of the political and financial ecosystem, if you will, and another is what is called the global talent gap in the energy sector, because many companies and institutions are reporting significant shortfalls in the skills of the people they need. Let me turn to the political framework. You'll see there some specific recommendations about what is needed. These are very resonant with the messages we got when we looked at this in our last 2 reports. But there's a quote that I think is apposite from our interviews this year. If you get the price right, the private sector will pile in. Now, you might say governments don't price energy unless they're regulating prices as such. Actually, governments are impacting on price all of the time by the nature of their interventions, even in relatively liberalised energy markets. And the question is whether they're really understanding the impact of those interventions. This impacts the cost of capital very significantly because, of course, the energy sector is heavily capital intensive. Projects take a long time to execute and even longer to pay back. Let's look at the financial community. These are the recommendations about what the financial community ought to be doing to help to create the right conditions for investment. Now, to some degree, I think this could be one of the most challenging parts of this report. The financial sector will go where the returns are. there is competition for their capital. So how can we get them to understand that actually they can grow the market for their investment by engaging in these discussions, rather than, as one or two might have said to us, well, if the conditions are right, we'll invest, and if they're not, we'll go somewhere else. And one of the points, I think, is that the interventions which are being made by international financial institutions or by governments setting up new mechanisms for financing energy investment need to avoid crowding out private sector investment for all sorts of reasons, including that that is going to be needed to do the investment at the scale that has to happen. And I was with someone from a very, very big finance house a couple of days ago, and she said, well, the problem is that you see a good project, by the time you get there, one of the development banks has invested. Now, that can't be the best use of that money, for which there are so many other calls and demands. So as with the financial sector needing to look beyond just the management of individual commercial issues for themselves, but to create the general system in which they can thrive, so with the energy sector. They can help create the context in which it is possible for them to bring forward more bankable projects. And in particular, by engaging with regulators and policymakers on the frameworks that they are putting in place. Sometimes people will say in energy companies, it would be a waste of my time, or why should I spend this amount of effort in contributing to the development of policy? That's for the policymakers. They'll do what they do. We just have to get on with it. But, you know, as soon as they begin to understand that making an input is welcomed, that their contribution has an impact and makes a difference, then I think you will see an increasing number of energy companies prepared to make the investment to understand the policymakers' language and to contribute to the evolution of the frameworks. So here we have it, a huge investment that is required, and even more if we are going to reach the 2-degree target, but that is a discussion for another day. As a percentage of GDP, globally, it's about 2%. It's low, it's only 1.2% in the US, China and Europe, but it's far bigger in most other countries, and it is in the developing countries where most of the additional infrastructure and most of the additional investment above trend will have to happen. Let me just finish with a quote which I think underpins what is said at the bottom about the need for joint working. The fundamental issue for lack of investment is the misconception at the political level of the risk-return equation. So, as I said before, if you get the price right on a risk-adjusted basis, then the private sector will pile in. So that's been a really rapid run-through what is an in-depth report. There are 2 volumes. You all have the executive summary, but there are copies of the other volumes outside for those who are quick enough to grab one, and it really does merit further study. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I hope that you will find it interesting. What we're going to do now, though, is move on to our very distinguished panel of speakers and ask them for their reactions, and also get some discussion going about some of the issues I've shared with you just over these last few minutes. I won't introduce them all in detail. I hope they'll forgive me for that, partly because I haven't got a note of their titles as I stand up here. But if I invite them to come up, and then as they each make their contributions. Perhaps they'll say who they are. But Jonathan, would you come up, and then Charles, and then Dean, please, and then Marie-José, going from left to right, and then Francois. Good, thank you. So if I haven't managed to, yes, I haven't managed to break the microphone. Let me suggest that we try and take a little journey through the policy, the financial area, and then people from the business world to round off. Sadly, we did have the energy regulator from Mexico to give us coverage of the US, Canada, and Mexico, i.e. the whole of North America. But he is ill. It's a long way for the bug to have travelled for him and Barry both to get it, but there we are. These things happen. So could I first ask Jonathan Pershing to introduce himself with his title and then his thoughts.
Great, thank you very much, Joan. It's a great pleasure to be here. Congratulations on this report. I really think it makes a significant contribution. This is now the second of the volumes you're rolling out. We'll get a lot of benefit as we all peruse and look through it. I'm Jonathan Pershing. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Technology and Policy, as well as the Principal Director, Deputy Director in the Office of Policy at the Department of Energy. And in that capacity, I'd like to offer just a few remarks on both the domestic side from the U.S. perspective and then a bit on the international side. I'll draw some of my comments from some recent work we're doing domestically on something called the Quadrennial Energy Review, which is an effort that was announced by the President last year. This year's framing is going to look particularly at infrastructure of transmission, distribution, and storage. And as part of that effort, we are, of course, looking a bit at some of the implications on the finance side. And on the international side, I'd like to speak and say a few words about some of the climate programs that are underway, not least the most recent announcements that have come through, which I think tie very much back into your frame. Let me start off by noting that I think that we're in a bit of a change in the paradigm in the energy sector. And we've got a series of new fuels. We're looking at new capacities in terms of renewables. We're looking at a pretty radical change in the price of technology. That, by extension, is shifting the dynamics of both supply and demand. And where heretofore we had a few countries that possessed the majority of these access options, we now have a much wider distribution of fuels. So you can have renewables pretty much anywhere in the world, although maybe a somewhat different variety. And increasingly you're finding that oil and gas are available more widely as well as the new technologies of hydrofracking come online. And we've got efficiency, which is really a potential globally. If you think about these options, and that's a bit of a different structure from where we used to be. At the same time, we've got adequate capital. And certainly the framework that we find domestically, but we've also found in our conversations internationally, is the problem is not that money is not available, the problem is money is not moving. And how do you make that distinction, and what are the policies that might lean in to make a difference on that front? On this score, I thought I'd give a couple of examples of constraints on the money, one domestic and one international. On the domestic side, we are currently in the midst of what many in the utility sector, the electricity utility sector, speak to as a downward spiral on the price of the ability to maintain an operating system. So how does that work? Well, it turns out that customers used to be connected to the grid, and the grid provided at a fixed price some kind of service, and that service was available, and reliability was assured, and there was a degree of redundancy in the system. But now, increasingly, consumers are seeking distributed resources, more control, more renewables, more localized generation. And the consequence is that many of them, and in some cases a pretty large number, for example, in the case of Hawaii, is upwards of 30%, are in fact looking at moving away from the centralized grid. But the grid is still seeking to maintain that reliable system, and now its revenues have declined. And what investment does it make? Well, it tends to make its investment in objecting to the policy shift and wants to prevent people from moving into distributed resources, because because that is the way of low income, loss of revenue, constrained economics. So the solution is going to have to be something that manages the utility in both a transition and in a new structure which enables this kind of distributed generation to move forward. Let me give you another example. We end up in that context with the issue of the Green Climate Fund. The States made a major announcement for the Green Fund. I think we're now looking at getting close to $10 billion collectively in that contribution. The idea behind it is to provide additional catalysts, resources, to move private sector investment around the world for low carbon technologies. And we see clearly a much larger array of interested parties than we certainly see adequate resources from that fund. And for many in the developing world, the focus has been not on how I use it as a catalytic resource, but how I really fund my project from it. And if we talk about the scale of finance required, an individual plant can cost upwards of $1 billion, and this would then buy 10 of them. That's not going to make it in a world that needs thousands. So unless we can figure out how to revise this and think about it, and the Green Fund is in some ways an interesting and new paradigm because it was designed explicitly with a private sector investment and engagement in mind. Just a couple of additional final thoughts on both capital and on some of the positions and barriers that prevent its movement.